Hello, my name is Peggy Zinke. I live in Trondheim, and I'm very happy that I can contribute to this little online conference with sharing my experience in using co-creation approaches for water management projects in Norway. My background is hydraulic engineering, and the foundations for that actually they were laid not too far away from you, from Praha, at the Technical University of Dresden, where I studied in the 1990s. And I moved to Norway in 2006, and I had afterwards the possibility to contribute to several research projects, both on behalf of the Norwegian Research Council, but also of different environment administrations in Norway. And the presentation is made not about a certain research project, but it's an attempt to summarize some experiences which I have made during several years, and looking at that now from another view, from a new view, in order to investigate how co-creative our workshops, for example, were during these projects. But in the beginning, I would like to invite you into a short introduction about Norwegian rivers. As you might expect, maybe the glacial history is very important for the landscape and the river types. During the last ice age, a large ice shield was covering Scandinavia, and this has affected both the landscape processes and also the river types which we find there today. And when it comes to climate, and in particular to precipitation, which is maybe the most important thing for hydrologists, then we see a strong distribution from a high precipitation area along the west coast, close to the Atlantic Ocean, with this oceanic climate, with precipitation rates of more than 4,000 millimeters per year, to the eastern or even the northeastern part, where you have rather low precipitation rates of locally less than 500 millimeters per year. When it comes to rivers, then we have many shorter rivers that drain into the Atlantic Ocean in the western part of the country. But the largest Norwegian river is Glomma in the eastern, or better in the southeastern part of Norway, with a maximum length of 620 kilometers and a mean discharge at the outlet at Fredrikstad of 705 cubic meters per second. Well, the climate and the northern position affects also the riparian vegetation and the species which you find there. I show you a map of the bioclimatic zones, which could be also interpreted as the vegetation map. And you see that we have only in the very southern part and in the lowest part along the west coast a climate that is characterized as boreonemoral. That means where you have like the trees that you would find in Central Europe, the deciduous trees. And then you have more the boreal or even the tundra. The distribution of two important floodplain species, for example, can illustrate that. In Central Europe, in the southern parts of Norway, and of course in Czech Republic, you have most often black alder, while the most floodplain forests in Norway, they are dominated by grey alder, or by a grey alder bird cherry woodland, which is a common tree and which is more adapted to the cold climate in the north. Norway has not adapted the European Habitat Directive, but it has developed its own classification system for nature. It's called Nature in Norway, or Natur i Norge. The abbreviation is NIN, which is the official mapping system. It has been mainly developed by a team of the University of Oslo, led by Rune Halvorsen. And It's the classification system for the ecological variation found in Norway that covers the terrestrial and the water areas of the entire country. It is still under development, in particular when it comes to the freshwater part. And I mentioned that here because we will later on show some workshops related to that. When it comes to the main river types in Norway, and here we are talking about hydromorphological river types, even though we have included some other parameter when it comes to saltwater, for example, then we can distinguish between the types which are shown here in this decision tree. We have very many rivers which are dominated by stones and boulders or bedrock rivers, because we have steep rivers, we have large slopes, in particular in the western part, but we have also river pool rivers. For example, many of the typical salmon rivers, they have at least some parts of these properties. We have some deeply incised rivers, often in clay, which are often situated in the clay areas below the so-called marine border. That means in areas which were formerly inundated by marine conditions. And we have also sandbed rivers, or we have rivers in peat, in particular in the higher mountains. And we have also rivers affected by salt water close to the fjord or to the sea, which are here grouped into a separate group. Norway has adopted the EU Water Framework Directive. And here I would like to show you an overview, which is available on the official webpage, which is called Vannnet, the water net, which shows you the ecological condition of the surface water bodies in the upper part. I assume that you are familiar with this 5-step classification from very good to very bad. And as we can see here, Norway has classified about 50% of its rivers in a good condition. Surface water bodies, we have to say, but there's also more than 1/4 that is in a moderate or even worse condition. And the most important impacts include hydropower production. This is really an important issue because Norway produces more than 90% of its electricity from hydropower. Apart from that, we have also long transported pollution, often related to acidification. We have flood impoundments, we have introduced species diseases. Of course, we have impacts due to mining and industry, now also to ongoing urban development, and also to agriculture, fisheries, fish farming. And the measures in order to improve the situations, they are related to the things which are shown in the lower part here, for example, to better urban wastewater treatment, to measures against diffuse pollutions, to improve the hydromorphological situations, and so on. But as we can see, more than 50% are, as it is called here, supplementing measures. So it can be a variation of different things, very specific to decide, which are described in these local water management plans now, and which need to be realized or are under realization already. It's always interesting to look at that close to the home place. So I'm showing you the situation here in Trondheim. Our main river is Nidelva, and this river is regulated by a hydropower system. We have in the southern part of the city a dam, Leierfossen, which is located as a waterfall. And this is also the end of the anadromic reach. And this lower part of the river, it's a salmon river. You can still go fishing there, but it's affected by hydropeaking. And it's here classified with a moderate quality and as a so-called heavily modified water body. You can see that in the dashed lines. And you see also some red dashed lines that are actually streams which are in a very bad condition. Many of them may be in culverts or pipes, which are almost not visible anymore. But we have also examples for a restored river reach here in Ilabecken. That's actually close to my place, where the municipality has invested some money in connection with a roadway construction project to reopen the river. So we have different examples here. We see there is a lot of things to do, and we see also that these rivers and streams are located here in an urban area with many stakeholders and with many interests to take into account, and we have to find measures or to realize them. And that's also the case actually in the hydropower regulated rivers, where there are often several user interests which have to be combined, or where a solution has to be found, for example, between competing interests of high hydropower conductions and high salmon production. So here we are at our Nidelva River in Trondheim with the wonderful flowering spur cherry trees on the right-hand side in spring. And how can we communicate and find good solutions for our rivers, lakes, and fjords when so many different stakeholders are involved and things get complicated? During the last few years, a lot of scientific methods and support tools have been developed for that. For example, the building block method or multi-criteria decision support tools. In a regulated river, they can, for instance, help to find a flow regime that is appropriate for many different user interests. These tools try to optimize certain parameters based on target value ranges. That means that you, as a stakeholder, should more or less know what you want, now or in future. Many of today's concerns and challenges in society, however, require decisions which take into account the uncertain future. We just have to look at the corona crisis now. And co-creation is a way of finding good solutions in an age of uncertainty or in times of crisis and transformation. And co-creation is a general term used across disciplines of business, design, and marketing to indicate new modes of engagement between people. There are many definitions for co-creation, which are available in literature, and I like this one the most by Rill and Hämmerleinen. They define it as co-creation is a creative process that taps into the collective potential of groups to generate insights and innovation. Specifically, it is a process in which teams of diverse stakeholders are actively engaged in a mutually empowering act of collective creativity with experiential and practical outcomes. And they distinguish between three phases, between the climb, which is an input stage aimed at opening up people's minds and to exchange knowledge and to bond the team, and phase of exploration, which means reframing the subject, diving into the unknown. And there are different methods to help the group in this phase. For example, physical activity or creative materials. And the third phase is a so-called rise. That's the movement towards outcomes, a so-called prototyping stage, where the group is creating new solutions. And the shape of the three phases, it resembles actually a U. And some co-creational processes can be related to the so-called theory U by Professor Otto Scharmer. And he is using the term presencing, sensing and presence. And according to him, on the journey on the bottom of the U, there lies an inner gate that requires us to drop everything that's not essential. And that's a process of letting go and letting come, which establishes a subtle connection to a deeper source of knowing. And once a group has crossed this threshold, nothing remains the same. And the individual members of the group and the group as a whole, they begin to operate with a heightened level of energy and sense of future possibility. So co-creation is a human-centered process which requires careful preparation and a spatial design that is appropriate for that. For example, having people sitting in a circle. It's often conducted at third places. That means not at home and not in the office. For example, outside in a retreat center, in a mountain cabin. And the so-called space between model, which is shown here, it shows how the space between the people, both the stakeholders and the team, the process with a certain program and facilitation, and the environment, the physical environment, and also the design helps to support the co-creation. And co-creation requires establishing a safe, authentic space wherein people can open themselves up and take risks without fear of consequences outside the space. For example, an employee should not fear his boss for any consequences about things he's saying there. And I'm now looking into or using this scheme to look into 3 examples of project workshops in order to assess to which degree co-creation has taken place and was possible. The first example is from a case group workshop with stakeholders in a regulated river catchments. The project objective was to study water management in regulated rivers and to examine different paths towards a more unified water management policy. And these workshops were part of a social science studies that has been conducted by my colleague Ingrid Nesheim from the Norwegian Institute for Water Research in Oslo. And she has also done all the organizational work around this workshop. So I want to acknowledge her because it took a lot of time. And the stakeholders that were asked to participate in this workshop, they came from local hydropower companies, from municipalities and district administrations, and from other interest groups, for example, hunting, fishing, tourist organizations, kayak experts, or local businessmen and landowners. Because of this setting, the workshop was conducted during the evening hours. And the setting was that we showed 2 presentations as an introduction. Then the groups had 2 hours of group work and discussion together. And in between, we had a coffee break. And the workshops were conducted in 2 different catchment areas in Western and Southern Norway, in meeting rooms or hotels of the local municipalities. And we had arranged for a group work setting with 4 groups and provided pencils, maps, and paper, and so on. This was in 2016. The groups represented very different stakeholders, and they had, after the introduction, only 2 hours for interaction. And we as researchers, we had prepared a set of instructions and lists which they needed or which they were asked to complete. And most groups tried to follow those instructions, and the schedule for them was very tight. You get a little impression of the setting here in the photo. The stakeholders were, for example, asked to explain the 7 most important river features for the following activities that were previously identified as relevant in their catchment: Atlantic salmon and fishing, hunting, rafting, kayak, canyoning, bathing, agriculture, education. And we got only very few creative contributions with drawings or so. One example is showing here. It illustrates the most important river features for canyoning. And this is an outdoor activity where groups walk through a canyon-like river environment, usually with some safety equipment and guided by a tour leader. And here the stakeholders who were familiar with this type of activities or were offering that to their clients, he pointed to the low water level that is needed, to a nice shore vegetation, and to birds and wildlife that are the most important features for them. In general, we made the experience that the space between, that means this creative atmosphere, it varied at the different locations and dates and also between the groups. It was very important that a careful preparation was done by my colleague with close contacts between her and the stakeholders to build up the trust that is important. And this took a lot of time, much more time than the event itself. Our second example deals with a workshop of experts to get input and comments on the further development of the freshwater part of this NIN nature classification systems, with focus on substrate and hydromorphology. Most of the experts knew each other in this workshop. They were fish biologists, ecologists, hydraulic engineers, river scientists, or people from water and environmental administrations. And the workshop lasted for 1.5 days, and we had half a day for group work and discussions. In between, we had lunch and coffee breaks together, and we had prepared a preparation note and questionnaires and work instructions. The venue was the building of the Norwegian Environment Agency in Trondheim, which is a modern building with nice group rooms located at the shore of the fjord. And we choose a group work setting with 4 groups, where the groups were focused on carp fishes, Atlantic salmon and sea trout, brown trout and grayling, or brown trout in higher mountains. All groups were given the same instructions and materials, for example, a list of symbols that they could use. And 2 groups choose to create their own drawings of the optimal river parameters and features. For example, here on the left-hand side, the carp group, they had drawn like an entire catchment, showing that the migration possibilities were very important for their fishes. While the group working with brown trout and grayling, that they had worked more on the river reach scale with a lot of smaller details that were important. For example, the type of spawning gravel that would be needed. Another group working with brown trout in the mountains, they had decided just to include a photo showing an optimal river reach and to group their discussions around that. And the 4th group working with Atlantic salmon and sea trout, they just choose not to make a sketch because according to them, everything is available in existing publications. And this reflects the fact that the anadrome river reaches with Atlantic salmon and sea trout, they are among the best investigated and studied rivers in Norway, with indeed a lot of publications. And many of the participants were actually co-authors of these research studies. Here we look more into the details of the sketch for the brown trout and grayling river. The group members used different colors for the symbols, for example, light blue for the flow types or dark green for the trees, red for the halophytes. So they made use of the symbols that were suggested in the group work instructions. It was not mandatory. And this is actually a very nice document for a person who or a researcher who afterwards should find out which parameters are the most important or typical. So a lesson that I learned from this workshop was it's important to let the group members themselves decide which tools they want to use, whether they use provided symbols or not, whether they make sketches or not. It doesn't help at all to force anything. It's really necessary to let the creativity of the group evolve from its own. Our third example, it's again a workshop for the development of the NIN system, again with experts, but now we focus on physically impacted rivers. The venue was this time Sverresborg Folkemuseum, a museum in Trondheim with a very nice outdoor area. The workshop lasted for 3 days, and we had 2 group work sessions, each half a day. And we had also time for walks outside after lunch, a field visit at the first day, and a walk in a small group a second day. We worked again with 3 groups. This time the focus of the groups was either on large lowland rivers or on rivers in woodland zones or small mountain streams. That gives you some impressions of this workshop. Of the field trip on the first day to a nearby stream. We are on the dam here. Then the outer area is Sverresborg, which we used for walks. And the group work, which consisted of I have called it a visual modeling of river impacts and relevant parameters, with the possibility also to not just sit there or work with paper, but also to work with symbols, texts, and creative materials. Here you get an impression of the materials that were provided. We had paper cards showing different species, for example, parameters, impacts, here for the fish, different type of erosion protection that is common in Norway, different or a classification with different classes for the lime content. And all these parameters, they were based on existing classifications, because one goal of the workshop was also to find out what's best suited or what are the relevant thresholds between the different groups. And we had also some wildcards where the participants could define their own parameters which they would miss or need. This is, for example, the lowland river before the construction of a dam. The group has paid attention to typical land use in the Norwegian lowland rivers, which can be either rather natural, forest, or agriculture, which is shown in brown here. And then they placed all the relevant parameters from different fields into this river. For example, the fishes that would commonly occur there, the invertebrates, macrophytes. They assigned some substrate and hydromorphological river types, some hydrological properties, and water chemistry. And they decided also in which part of the country they would find this river type. This was in order to describe the intact river before any impacts, or before dam impacts at least. So agriculture has been there for centuries, and this is somehow regarded as a precondition. This is the same river after the construction of the hydropower dam. You can see that a dam has been constructed here, and we have several properties to describe it. For example, the type of spillway, or whether there is a fish passage or not. And we see now we have a small reservoir behind the dam. It's in a river, so it's not really a large lake reservoir, but it's a backwater section of the river. And this affects, of course, the processes and also the species. So we have maybe some other substrate types there, more sand, fines because of the lower flow velocity. We have changed flow types. Chemistries may be still the same, but we have other species there. And these descriptions, they were created really in a living interaction between the researchers. For example, hydraulic engineers who would exactly describe how a typical dam in the Norwegian lowland rivers would look like, what type of spillway they would have, or regulation mechanisms. And then the biologists would describe what they find in these conditions. And I have observed that when we played around with the cards as shown here, then we started to communicate much easier across disciplines, and also to leave behind our roles a little bit, or the function as stakeholder, for example, of a certain administration or institution. So I think there is maybe a much higher potential in the co-creation approach in general, and also in using this kind of supporting creative materials. I have, however, the impression it may require some other settings where the participants also can go even further behind their role as a stakeholder and to be there just as a human with their essence and with all their senses and life experiences. So in the examples which I have shown so far, this has not been so much the case. And it can be even a problem because if you are conducting this kind of workshop for a client, for example, from an administration, for them it's very important that nobody leaves this role, that people stay in their role for a certain administration and do not step over this threshold. So I think it's a process when we want to use co-creation, where we have to go together and allow us also to step more into this being just a human there and open up for creativity. And then just afterwards sort out what can be related again to some administrational structures that are necessary. I have shown you that co-creation is a creative process that taps into the collective potential of groups to generate insights and innovation. We have investigated this space between people, environment at the program for different workshop settings in 3 water management related projects. The atmosphere in the space between varied between different projects, location and groups. In general, I would say that the degree of co-creation was increasing from example 1 to example 3. And nevertheless, for all workshops, careful preparation was and is important and takes time, often more time than the event itself. And a program with some physical outdoor activities, for example, nature walks, can help to build up the atmosphere of trust and respect that is needed for this co-creative process. It also brings our body into the right energy if you're not just inside, but have some physical activity. And this should be a criterion also for choosing the venue. The creative game with this visual modeling of rivers and impacts that I have shown you may be a promising approach that can be developed further, maybe also for communication with stakeholders in municipalities. Better co-creation requires also that the instructor or the organizer is able to leave his role as instructor or moderator and can rather act as a host. It has been and it is therefore also a learning process for myself. It's a journey which has just started. And I would like to thank you for joining me on this part. And I'm looking forward to cooperate with you or with some of you and to meet in real life in Czech Republic and in Norway. I would like to thank you all. Goodbye.